You know what's cool about having been an environmental studies professor for like 5 years or whatever is that literally every semester that I've taught, right at the start of the term, some super fucked up disaster that is the first of its kind
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah.
Like literally all 10 semesters I've been teaching, it's always something every time. It's the California wildfires, it's the Australian bushfires.
Massive flooding in Pakistan. It's the cyclone in
Oh my
every time.
God. I want to introduce someone I'm very excited to speak to, and I feel in a lot of ways maybe kindred spirits, but Ashwin Ravikumar, professor of environmental studies at Amherst College, and also I don't want to leave out a lot of the myriad of other things you do involves traveling around the world, engaging in different organizations that plan and develop ideas around the climate crisis. So thank you for coming in.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
First off, I kind of just do want to start off with a little bit of your background of where you're coming from. Can you kind of just tell us, how did you get into climate studies and then like getting into being a professor as well?
Yeah, no, 100%. So yeah, my name's Ashwin. Let's see, I'm a 37-year-old millennial. And what that means is that the Iraq War and Afghanistan were foundational to my like understanding of the world, which is part of why I'm excited to be here. But yeah, I had a very similar political development to a lot of people of my kind of generational cohort, which is to say I was kind of swimming in the waters of liberalism. My family is originally from India. They moved to the U.S. in '78. I was born and brought up in sort of a white middle class suburb, primarily in the Midwest, eventually the Chicago area. But yeah, 9/11, Iraq War, kind of got me really morally spooked about the world that we live in a massive way. And then just seeing super majority support for Iraq and Afghanistan around me everywhere kind of really made me kind of lose faith in the possibility of U.S. society ever building anything better. It's like, oh, you don't care about the lives of people on the other side of the world? Well, maybe you don't care about my life either. That sucks. Well, I guess I'm just going to be a liberal now that Bush is in power and I can't really imagine anything better, et cetera. So that was me for like the 2000s. I got into like environmental studies and the climate sort of crisis because that was all the rage to think about back in like 2005, Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore vibes and that kind of stuff.
Yes, yeah. Shout out to the creator of the internet.
But I was coming at it from like a very kind of liberal political sort of perspective. And that really started to shift for me, like, again, a lot of people my age around the time of Occupy, which started to open up just a much bigger space of possibility for what I could imagine. So anyway, I went to grad school around the time of Occupy, and then I basically became, at this point, we're talking 2013, my politics are already a lot more left than liberal, let's say.
Yeah.
But I essentially got a job as a global eco-technocrat motherfucker, like living in like Lima. I was basically working for like kind of a UN World Bank adjacent.
Yeah.
And to put it bluntly, my job was to fly around the world in circles, paid for by the Norwegians and the Germans, and tell them that their like carbon market-based neoliberal solutions to tropical deforestation weren't working that well. But I'd tell them real nicely so it wouldn't actually upset them that much.
Yeah. Well, you got to be nice. This is where, looking into your background, I would say there's kindred spirits where it's like, I served in the Marine Corps, but then I became a staffer for a member of Congress for a few years.
Yeah.
Had that same type of getting a good look at a T-bone steak, if we can, steal one. Moving on from there, after you're changing your politics, and then what gets you into academia?
Yeah, so basically, academia was kind of an accident. I was doing that global technocrat stuff, and then at that point, I was like, all right, I'm flying around the world in circles, telling the Norwegians that their dumb market-based solutions don't work that well. Getting a real good look at the inside of a T-bone steak for sure.
Yeah.
Like 1 week I'd be in Oslo talking to international donors. The next week I'd be like running a workshop in the Amazon with like indigenous communities, but just from a really fucked up and patronizing kind of angle, like mad like beer complex kind of stuff going on. And I was like, all right, you know what? I've taken too much LSD to take this stuff seriously, even though this is like an extreme global like validation machine.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to find something else to do. So, I did some other nonprofit work that was a little less shitty. It's still, a nonprofit. Nonprofit's going to nonprofit, but it was at least like more advocacy focused. So from that point, I was working, I was still doing tropical forest and indigenous movement kind of work, but from a nonprofit. And we were advocating for land rights for indigenous Amazonians in Peru. And I got, a pretty good look at what that looked like. But one of the things that really struck me there is like, okay, we have successfully gotten like 5 protected areas under co-management regimes with indigenous Peruvian Amazonians over the last 5 years. But we did it through like a super fucking technocratic theory of change. We like would find a bureaucrat in the government that was amenable to our idea and like lobby them essentially. What I was realizing, this is when Trump is getting elected. I'm like living in the US again. I joined DSA at the time and I start getting involved in like more local organizing stuff. And I'm realizing what I'm doing professionally has absolutely no connection to mass movements, no connection to mass people powered politics. And I can't really stomach that gap anymore between the climate policy work that I'm doing internationally and the mass movement building that drives my democratic kind of mass theory of change here in the US, right? Yeah. So I kind of applied for an academic job just in a moment of weakness and kind of thinking like, I can at least be more critical about this stuff as a professor and write critically about it and teach students and, help them, support them in getting involved in organizing work, which is, if we talk about Palestine stuff, which we certainly can, that's been at the top of my mind.
It's the next stop.
Totally. So we'll get there. But yeah, that was a little bit kind of what happened. So then more recently, like as an academic, as a professor, I've been just taking a more critical look at some of that international technocratic stuff that I used to be a cog for. And at the same time, really advocating for what I see as the big mass movements that are actually real enough and coherent enough to do something about climate change. And to me, that's not international technocrats. It's the labor movement. It's the housing and tenants movement. It's the movement to abolish police and prisons. It's indigenous frontline fights against fossil fuel infrastructure. These are the mass mobilizing movements in the U.S. That are actually going to build enough power to really confront the climate crisis.
Now,
I'm trying to support those things in my work.
I am going to have to halt you on the mass movement stuff, okay?
Yeah.
This is the internet. You can't just start talking about real solutions until the end of the interview, because that's more of the positive up ramp. But like you had mentioned, and I appreciate you kind of going into your backstory, I think leads into a lot of the effort that has been going on now as far as the now international student movement that had been, started, which I don't expect much out of the Ivy Leagues or like Columbia, and seeing students on those campuses really kind of be, that forefront, was insanely impressive. So yeah, if you would please now speak to some of the work you've done helping organize, students on campus, but also being engaged with a faculty group that is now working in conjunction with the divestment of any funds to Israel.
Yeah, happily. So at the small college that I teach at, Amherst College, we actually didn't have an encampment. But down the road at UMass, there was a pretty big encampment. And there was I just want to shout out some of the student groups there that I had the opportunity to connect a bit with that did amazing stuff there. Yep. So the UMass dissenters, along with SJP, have just been doing great stuff. And dissenters started out way before October 7th, focused on getting Raytheon off campus, getting, all these big weapons manufacturers off campus to get them to stop recruiting on campus. And so they had this like sort of deeper anti-military on campus background. And that was really essential for the amazing work that they did. But so as a faculty member, what went down is that we as faculty, and we're at a small college that claims to care about faculty governance. And so we found a little known bylaw in our faculty bylaws that allow for any 8 faculty to call an all faculty meeting for any reason. No one has ever invoked this in like 50 years or some shit like that.
Incredible. As a bureaucrat guy, I love that so much. You could read the rules because you could use them.
The rules. Exactly. So if there's any fellow faculty or even students out there at small schools like mine listening, you might want to check if you have a bylaw like this, because you can weaponize this shit for Palestinian solidarity. So basically, we called a whole faculty meeting to vote on divestment, to urge our board of trustees to divest. And then me and about 15, 20 faculty, we did all the organizing things. We, did one-on-ones with our colleagues. We did agitprop. We had teach-ins. We did a lot of outreach just to mobilize people to make sure that they actually turned up to this meeting, because it's a extra meeting at the end of the semester when everyone's busy and that kind of thing, right? Anyway, and of course we planned what we were going to say in the meeting itself, and we were quite well choreographed, and we planned things pretty well as our faculty and staff for Justice in Palestine chapter. And the other thing I'll say is that in the lead up to this vote, honestly, it just felt really great to like have so many comrades among the faculty. It made just the experience of going to work and like going to my office sucks way less now, because I just see so many more comradely faces. I mean, it's fucked up to even think about anything positive here, but like it's still
can you kind of give about like what the was it about half, or at least how much of the faculty do you think you're actually able to reach, and then out of how many of them do you think were a part of the supportive?
Totally. So we're a small college. We only have like 220 faculty total, teaching faculty. Okay, so right, I'll tell you what happened. So we won the vote by about a 2/3 majority, which was fantastic. So whatever 2/3 of 220 is, you can do the arithmetic. Yeah. But in terms of how many, so out of 220 people, there was like 20 to 25 people that were actually actively organizing, like taking on tasks, signing up to do one-on-ones, helping to print out educational materials. Yeah. Like actually signing up to do stuff. You know what I mean? Which is, to me, those are great numbers. Like having been around a lot of movements in the past, like that's a fantastic number.
10% effort with 66%, result.
Exactly. 100%. So that was really great. And of course, meanwhile, the students, of course, played a huge role in this. And we couldn't have done any of this without the students. So the students were lobbying professors directly. They took their own vote simultaneously as student government, and they were like unanimous in support of divestment, or almost unanimous. And then anyway, the semester wraps up. The administration does what they always do, which is wait for sort of the energy to evaporate a little bit.
Yep.
The board of trustees deliberates in June, and they informed us about 10 days ago or something like that, that they're not going to divest. No surprises there. Yeah. No surprises. But now we know what these people actually think about faculty governance. We now know that we have a supermajority of students, a near supermajority of faculty, saying we want divestment. And then we have the board of trustees saying we are not going to do that anyway. Yeah. So let's think about this. What does this tell us about who they're accountable to, right? It tells us that they're accountable to presumably a group of donors and other financial interests that are not directly involved in the actual work of education that we do at the college, but are instead interested in essentially maintaining the flow of cash into the institution. So in my mind, this is essentially the board saying that if you want democracy, faculty governance, basic human morality, an end to our support for a fucking genocide to happen, you're going to need to escalate and make our lives a lot harder than you have so far. To me, that's what they're saying.
And I think the only other option is just you chose democratically wrong, and next time choose democratically right. But no, and this is where I don't want to go too much into what that escalation may look like, you know what I'm saying? Because that's probably something you should keep close to home. But I'm just going to go ahead and say I'd be very interested to talk with you, sometime after the fall, when y'all come back onto campus and get things going. But moving past that and the actions on campus and into, I think, what is the paramount issue in our world, which of course it should be, is the genocide that the United States is supporting and protecting in Gaza. And I think some of the work that you've been a part of, and in my opinion, really been able to accurately tie where these issues not are only the worst crime imaginable in human history of genocide, but these actions have a historic background, and they will also lead us into an unsurvivable planet. So, to simply put, decolonization, degrowth. Can you please just speak to not only the issue in Palestine, but how do these things connect in your understanding?
100%, yeah. And to put it really fundamentally, the root cause of climate change, as I think a lot of your listeners will be sort of aware of, is capitalism. And there's a large consensus about this, right? Everyone kind of recognizes this pretty strongly. And in particular, it's not just capitalism, but it's imperialism, right? The kind of the imbalance between the North and the South, the flow of resources from the South to the North every year is at the core of the climate crisis and other ecological crises, right? So every year there's a massive drain of labor, of land, of natural resources from the South to the North that drives huge ecological problems that has huge carbon emissions associated with it. And none of the tinkering around the edges that the global North has done has made a dent in any of this, because the whole system is oriented towards maintaining this basic flow of resources. And so, to my mind, Palestine has emerged as a hinge point, a pivot point for the entire system of the world. And so all of our attentions on Palestine, that the resistance by the imperial core to making significant changes in the United States' policy of support for Israel is such a strong indicator, is a really strong indicator that the overall system of capital accumulation depends on maintaining precisely this existing order in the region. And indeed, this is true around the world, right? And so one of the things that I think has been really inspiring to see in how movements right now and the movement for Palestine is articulating this stuff is that people have been really understanding that these issues are deeply connected, right? And in particular, one of the things that I think is really great is that we're seeing a really principled movement that's tying all this stuff together on campuses, that's not willing to isolate different issues from the bigger stuff that they're fighting for. So to get more specific, how does the struggle for justice in Palestine, the struggle to for Palestinian resistance connect to something like the climate crisis? Well, fundamentally, why is the United States interested in supporting Israel and supporting this genocide and maintaining power?
Freedom and democracy?
It's freedom and democracy for
nice.
Capital to accumulate at the expense of other people.
Oh,
right?
fuck.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the freedom that.
Yeah.
And what that means is that the United States is never going to allow for an alternative pole of accumulation to emerge anywhere in the world, whether that's Iran, whether that's China, whatever you think about the internal politics of those regimes, which are deeper conversations. The United States absolutely cannot countenance any changes there. And so here, to kind of bring it home here a little bit, I think the prevailing kind of democratic socialist theories of change, certainly in the global North, have, for most of my kind of adult life, gone something like this. People are currently crushed in the U.S., for example, under the boot of neoliberalism. They can't afford healthcare, they can't afford housing, they can't afford basic services, right? And so if we can, through kind of a Bernie Sanders style politics, social democratic politics, provide for people's basic needs, with the boot off of their necks a little bit, people will be able to breathe a little bit more. With the cops out of the picture a little bit, people will be able to breathe and have more space to imagine a better future for everybody, right? Because just giving people healthcare and housing in the United States, in Europe, isn't going to solve climate change. It's not going to get rid of imperialism. It's not going to fix underlying inequalities between the North and the South. I mean, just look at Scandinavia. We can not only imagine, but see societies that have a lot of, that are relatively egalitarian internally, but so much of their social wealth still depends on the hyper exploitation of people and resources in the global South. But there's kind of this we're doing a little bit of yada yada in there. It's like step one, get people healthcare and housing. Step two, yada yada. Step three, get rid of imperialism. And I think the movement for Palestine right now in the global North is addressing and filling in the fucking gaps on that yada yada. And I think that is incredibly significant. And we can't stress enough how important that is. And we're now seeing anti-imperialism inflect more and more every other movement in the US. There's still a lot more to be done, but whether it's labor, housing, police and prison abolition, and we can talk more about each of these, or struggles against fossil fuels, the movement for Palestine is providing an anti-imperialist analysis for those things that is actually going to be able to point us towards a future that doesn't have imperialism, that can address ecological problems, and can actually produce kind of global justice. So that's kind of my kind of bird's eye view of how I'm thinking about it. There's lots more details to unpack, of course.
Oh, yeah. If we have a good time, you can be back and we can go into very specific things. But I do kind of also want to move on of where, especially when it comes to the climate now, is where we are also feeling the effects. Every summer, it seems like, at least within the United States, you just go into it that like half the country is going to be flooded, the other half is going to be on fire, and then whoever survives to winter, congratulations, Christmas, and then here we go again, and I wonder, especially too within Hurricane Beryl and what it represents as one of those representations of this is the first hurricane to occur in July, first category 5, especially this early. I'm just kind of curious as what is your overall understanding of what is happening right now and how we are kind of seeing it and how Americans are dealing with it as well, kind of. Big one, but
yeah, absolutely. Well, you know what's cool about having been an environmental studies professor for like 5 years or whatever is that literally every semester that I've taught, right at the start of the term, some super fucked up disaster that is the first of its kind happens.
Yeah,
like literally all 10 semesters I've been teaching, it's always something every time, and I've just tracking that has been quite an experience. It's the California wildfires, it's the Australian bushfire. The massive flooding in Pakistan. It's the cyclone in the Indian Ocean. Every time it's something. It's the Houston. Texas ice storm.
And I'm sorry for interrupting you. Just kind of want to sit with that. The fact that you are an environmental studies professor for over the past 10 years, being able to set the beginning of each semester to a first of its kind climate disaster.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Maybe more or less. I think we can round it up to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, yeah. Close enough. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Pretty fucked up.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds terrifying. Well, take it. Yeah. So as far as what is happening to our world and what is the response of the general public that you see, and then we can go and start going into like some of the movements on the ground that are actually kind of able to act, stop these types of things.
Yeah, totally. Well, so to the nature of the problem itself and the kind of conjuncture that we're at with respect to the Earth's climate system and the economic system that drives and interacts with it, it's pretty bad. It's pretty grim. We've got runaway emissions. We have, a global north that is putting out milquetoast proposals for more renewable energy that are doing very little to move the needle. We have economic growth continuing to sort of dominate, and like the drive for economic growth is still the dominant paradigm in the global north, even though the global north consumes far more than its fair share of products that generate emissions and is historically responsible for tremendous emissions. But what all that means is that we are going to continue to see these kinds of things happening. We're going to continue to see more frequent and more severe climate-driven disasters, including things like prolonged multi-year droughts that are going to have huge and are already having huge consequences for agriculture, that are going to drive and accelerate the already, again, because this stuff is already happening, climate refugees that are fleeing primarily, again, from the global south to the global north. And we're going to see political reaction to that stuff. And we're already seeing all of this stuff. People often say that the United States doesn't have a climate policy. We do have a climate policy. It's called a military, and it's called border walls, and it's called cops. That's essentially our climate policy in the United States. And so without major transformations, that's the direction that we're going, is just increasing pressure on global south populations, increasing pressure on our super messed up food system, increasingly devastating disasters that we simply don't have the capacity to respond to, adapt to, preempt, all over the world, but especially in the global south. And in terms of how people are responding to it, If you actually look at polls in the global north, supermajorities of people say that they explicitly say we think it's more important to protect the environment and to address climate change than it is to pursue economic growth for growth's sake. Most people don't want economic growth instead of environmental policy. Economic growth basically benefits elites and corporate bottom lines. Most people aren't benefiting from so-called economic growth anyway. And some of this polling, and there's some recent stuff out there that I've been seeing, reflects that in a way that I think shows us that like regular people from all different kind of swaths of society have a pretty intuitive understanding of this. And the idea that this is somehow like a niche issue that only affects or is only of interest to, climate activists or elites or something like that is just not true.
At least that's like happy to hear, because at that point too, it's like I think it kind of alludes to the necessary thing is not necessarily to change minds, but actually be able to develop alternative systems. Maybe we can start getting into some of the positives before we. There are some interesting things that I think you've done with in Peru as far as not only around the labor movement, but being able to like create more of a sustainable interlock society, and then like kind of like how that can grow from there. So if you could just kind of talk to some of your experiences in Peru, and what are some of the organizations, not say organizations, but they should be named, but also like what are the policies that are able to when delivered to the public actually change society?
100%, yeah. And so one of the this is getting a little bit into my kind of more seemingly wonky research or whatever, but in the Peruvian Amazon, me and one of my actually former students, shout out to Sarah, absolute wizard with the data, but we took a bunch of data from the Peruvian Amazon, and this is pretty simple to explain, but basically there's lots of wonky environmental policies coming from the global north that are trying to do things like, hey, indigenous people, we'll pay you $3 per hectare of forest that you don't cut down, and it's going to be really expensive to monitor, and we're going to give you drones, and we're going to give you GPSs and all this technology to monitor tropical forests. And by the way, for listeners that might not know, the reason we care so much about tropical forests is that about 20% of carbon emissions that drive climate change every year actually come from deforestation, primarily in the tropics. Tropical forests hold a shit ton of carbon, and when they get cut down, that supercharges climate change in a way that we really don't need right now. Anyway, so there's all these policies that are like, we'll pay you $3 a hectare to not cut down forest. It's going to be a pain in the ass to measure, and the money's not that much, and we're going to make you fill out a bunch of paperwork. Meanwhile, these same communities don't have sanitation. They don't have running water. Oftentimes, they actually do have, and this is pretty interesting, they have really sophisticated systems for agriculture that have been developed over hundreds or even more years. They'll cut down one part of a forest one year, allow it to regenerate with fruits and timber species and medicinal plants for 5, 10, 15 years while they grow their crops in another area. And then they might chop that down, burn it, and rotate the fields. And they do this over the course of decades, centuries, in some cases. It's a truly dizzying diversity of incredibly sophisticated agroecological techniques for doing agriculture, techniques that enhance biodiversity, that maintain forest carbon stocks, that are good for the ecosystems, right? But so there's no policy support for any of this stuff. Instead, it's drones, GPSs, technology, and here's a few bucks to not cut down a forest, right? So we did a quick study. We said, hey, what happens if instead of all this hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo, technocratic nonsense, you just gave indigenous people healthcare, education, and sanitation, and see what the fuck happens? Turns out, and this is kind of hot off the presses, if you control for all the other factors, roads, etc., where the state does have more investments and where movements have successfully lobbied for more investments in running water and sanitation and education and healthcare, deforestation is a lot lower. Everything else aside. So you don't need all these neoliberal market-based kind of systems to conserve forests. It turns out that people are already interested in conserving forests. And when people have secure land rights and their basic needs are met, there's less of a push to deforest. And you don't need to convert all this stuff into a frontier for commodities to export coffee and cocoa and oil palm and other stuff to the global north. So that's one place where I think we can all be advocating more, and I think it's kind of heartening to see that something so basic does actually kind of work in a way.
I'm going to mess it up in the names, but there's different pillars: degrowth and decolonialization, right?
Yeah.
And some of the indigenous mindset. And I do, at least for like the audience, this is not the very flippant neoliberal, oh, let's just give a land acknowledgement as we cut the ribbon on the Raytheon factory. Because like you said, there are human beings, we're not new. The necessity for clean water and food, not new. People have figured out ways to sustainably do these things, and we do need to look at those ways to get back. So not only just kind of indigenous and long-lasting, centuries-old practices that work, right? If it ain't broke, right? But then there's a lot of the United States where it's like they don't want to give up the treats, right? Yeah. So how do these things tie together? And if we can kind of say it's like, this will actually enrich our lives, because that's what I truly believe, right? This will just make us better, not worse.
100%. Yeah. So let's get into kind of because where this is pointing is, like you said, towards degrowth, which I think is so. Yeah. Let's go to degrowth.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that maybe some folks in the audience have heard about it. I would strongly recommend not learning about degrowth from Twitter.
Yes.
Twitter is a terrible place to learn about what degrowth actually means. It's just an absolute cacophony of kind of bad faith arguments that are really tedious and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so degrowth is fundamentally the idea that the total material size of the economy needs to come down from what it is right now in order to keep the planet within sort of ecological limits. And it's also the idea that unequal exchange between the South and the North needs to be halted and reversed. And another really good framework for this is the climate debt framework, which I think is really helpful in order to address ecological crises appropriately. And I was in some of my recent travels, I was just at the International Degrowth Conference in Pontevedra, Spain, which was a really, really great time. There's different tendencies within degrowth. Some degrowthers are like hardcore anti-imperialist Marxist-Leninists. Others are kind of more anarchists. Others kind of don't think about power as much and just kind of stop it. We need to make things smaller. But I do think that the core insight from degrowth, whatever your politics, whatever your kind of particular political tendency, are really helpful. Because fundamentally, in order to reduce emissions rapidly, we do need to see changes in lifestyles in the global north. And now there's different ways to think about this. I would argue, and I would suggest that this does not mean austerity, that this does, like you said, Marcus, mean that we can make our lives better. It's more about like less time spent in your car and more spent and less time at work, for that matter. One core degrowth demand is a shorter work week, which the United Auto Workers actually, by the way, shout out, adopted just last year and actually called for explicitly, which is a pretty big deal. A shorter work week would reduce emissions dramatically. One of the best things we could possibly do for emissions and quality of life. But yeah, it's not about giving up treats. It's more about more time hanging out with your friends in the park, more time enjoying public goods, more time being able to do cool stuff at the library or the public pool or the beach or the park, right? So it's all about kind of more of these common things, right? Now, there is a reality here that I don't want to deny. Like, if you're going to ask, do I get to have, these debates always get stupid on Twitter, but like, do I get to have bananas all year in Ohio in the future? The answer to that might actually be no. Maybe you don't get to have bananas all year in Ohio forever. But again, I think the idea that, like, first of all, we're a ways away from that, but also the idea that that's going to be this sort of intractable thing politically, I just don't really think bears out with what people actually want. Now we got to organize for this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And this is where, though, it's just like some of the agricultural things that I've seen. Well, you actually probably could. You just got to figure out a way to do it on your own.
Yeah.
Like who's to say you can't create some type of climate controlled structure, where you're able to, cultivate a certain amount of soil, do whatever. People import New York water to make bagels in LA. Figure it out.
Yeah, no,
So
it's definitely possible. If we imagine like a post-revolutionary world where like the global working class controls all the technology and means of production, yeah, we could imagine a way that to maybe get some bananas to Ohio without fighting anybody.
yeah, getting past that yada 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 of
Right.
post-revolution,
Yeah.
because at the beginning of this, and this might be a good nice tale to wrap everything up, is you were mentioning some movements within the United States that are at the forefront of really tackling that issue of not only what's next, but how do we get to what's next?
Yeah.
How do we build these structures? How do we develop these policies? How do we build power to influence society? And so if you could kind of even go through some of the things that some of the organizations and movement structures that you see that are making those moves beneficial to that, so that the audience can, hopefully send an email out to one of them and get involved.
Yeah, 100%. So I think what I said at the beginning is if we look at like what are the big kind of mass movements in the US right now that are mobilizing lots of people, that are organizing new people, that are politicizing folks that weren't so political before. The labor movement, obviously a big one. We've seen strike waves, we've seen new organization over the last 5-6 years. Really good stuff happening all over the place. Again, starting a union does not automatically mean you're going to do anti-imperialist stuff. It doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be, getting better. If you work at a Starbucks, you deserve better wages, you deserve healthcare, you deserve shorter hours. Doing that doesn't automatically lead to, ending U.S. empire or even necessarily point to it. So I think that within the labor movement, we're seeing a lot of really militant stuff happening that I see as being really powerful. Like there's groups within the Teamsters that are taking a really strong line on Palestine. And if you're in a place that has any organizing of new shops happening, show up to support them. Out here where I live, there's this one block in the middle of rural Western Mass where we had, I think, the first Trader Joe's union, the first Michael's union, and there was another big first in there as well. But we had the Starbucks also unionized. So we had this kind of wave of stuff happening here. And it was a really cool opportunity to show up to the picket line, show up in support. My DSA chapter was doing a lot of that stuff, which was really good. So labor, that's the first one. The second one, and this is a huge one, is the movement for tenants and housing justice against landlords, eventually trying to push for public housing. So the housing crisis in the U.S. has gotten to a point where even like middle-class people and even some people that like have upper middle-class parents are getting fucked by this, right? The contradictions are unsustainable.
Yeah. And
so we're seeing dozens, I think maybe hundreds. I looked at the numbers a while ago of new tenants associations and unions across the country. The Los Angeles Tenants Union, DC, Kansas City. If you want to hear some really good insights on like the deeper weeds of campaigns, plug for a podcast called The Craft of Campaigns. It's a limited mini series that really gets into the weeds of how the Kansas City Tenants Union won some major battles, how, a group in Memphis, Tennessee stopped a natural gas pipeline. Anyway, lots of good stuff there. But so the tenants union is really important for all of this stuff because a lot of these organizations have taken strong stances on Palestine. They're engaged really furiously in municipal politics and really bringing a form of class struggle to municipalities that I think is incredibly important. And because everyone's getting fucked over by rent being too high, it has tremendous mass mobilizing potential. So wherever you live, you can get involved in local tenant organizing. And I think that that's a super important thing to do. Tenants organizing also really matters for the climate crisis because a huge amount of our emissions in this country come from the housing sector and from buildings. The fact that your landlord has no incentive to give you to put solar panels on your house because you're the one stuck paying the utility bill, right? So there's certain municipalities that are trying to pass ordinances, and tenants unions are fighting for this to change that and to make it so that landlords do have to fucking foot the bill for renewable energy for you, that they do have to upgrade your windows and all that good stuff so that your house is more efficient. So this is a movement that has a huge ecological footprint and that's taken a lot of a strong line on Palestine and has big mass mobilizing potential. So huge plug there. Can't stress enough how important that is. The third one is the movement for defunding and, eventually maybe abolishing policing in prisons. So after 2020, this popped up as the mass mobilizing event of a generation in the U.S. I think it was the most people out in the streets like ever in the United States for anything, right? Yeah. And sure, and a lot of people when they talk about it kind of say, look, it was a big mobilization, but ultimately it got co-opted into hashtags and corporations saying Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And while I think that there's certainly some truth to that, and I don't want to deny that the co-optation happened, but on a more optimistic note, I would also just point to the fact that there are dozens of organizations, primarily Black-led, in municipalities across the United States that are continuing the fight to defund police and reinvest in community. And to me, they have actually opened up another front in the class struggle in the form of contests over municipal budgets around policing. So if there's any organizations doing that work where you're at, definitely another thing to get involved in. And now with Palestine out here in Western Mass, an organization that I organize with called Northampton Abolition Now, the current campaign that we're really trying to launch is divest, defund, reinvest in community, right? So we're trying to connect the struggle for divestment from Israel's genocide by the United States to defunding police and reinvesting in community. So simultaneously fighting for that sort of thing. And I know there's a lot of organizations across the country that are really uniting those things together. Here in Northampton, we got a Department of Community Care established that's doing non-police crisis response. There's lots of limitations to it, but there's lots of these, and there's still a lot more to be done to make sure that it doesn't just become kind of a soft form of policing, et cetera.
Yeah.
There's lots of little victories like this across the country that I think are really significant. Seattle, Oakland, all these places.
Yeah, which I think Seattle, they've been able to have some data come out of some of their programs as far as having like a crisis response instead of policing, and like there's been very positive as far as like not lowering the amount of arrests, lowering the amount of violence, that's contributed by the police and communities. So those are all very, very fantastic things. And this is where, and also too, it is very important seeing as all of these things connecting and overlapping, especially towards that. It isn't just that, the drive towards profits, right? That as you've mentioned over the a myriad of issues, those drive towards profits are unpopular as it comes to rent, nature, empire, even because there's everybody's will complain about the spending on the military, but we don't have the apparatus to stop the people in power from spending $1 trillion, on the military budget for the past 2 years, because that one military budget doesn't factor in all of those supplementals of billions and billions and billions that come afterwards. And, now I'm going into my, just the explosion of manufacturing effort that has been solely directed at the military industrial complex because of these conflicts that have come up and everything like that.
So just the one last kind of movement that I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
So we got labor, housing, abolition, and then I would also throw in indigenous fights against fossil fuel infrastructure. And I would say that Cop City, Atlanta, really brings the indigenous struggle against for land and land back right together with abolition. So those are like kind of some of the big four in terms of mass movements that you can support. And then honestly, Palestine has changed everything. All four of those things, you can't understand any of that stuff without thinking about the Palestine solidarity movement. And like when I'm out at like an encampment or a standout out here, I see people at the standouts for Palestine that I know from the picket line outside of Trader Joe's, that I know from the tenants unions that I bring in to talk to my students, that I know from Cuba solidarity work, that I know from all these other different kinds of struggles. And so it's amazing to me that people from all these different movements, certainly from abolition, are coming out for Palestine. And it makes it even more hilarious when you hear allegations that like these are anti-Semitic movements. It's like, no. You know who I see at the standouts out here? Labor organizers, tenant organizers, Cuba solidarity organizers, Filipino solidarity organizers, abolitionists. You know what I don't see? A bunch of people that were just sitting around being latently anti-Semitic, waiting for an opportunity to express that in the streets. Zero of that, all of the other stuff. And I just think that's hugely fucking significant.
I'm in the DMV, so I've been to a few organized events. And actually, one of the earlier on ones that Marjorie Taylor Greene described as a insurrection, another January 6th. But the people who were, storming the Capitol were all like rabbis and, other Jewish people who organized the protest and were getting arrested. And it's just like this, it is kind of like this insane amount of gaslighting where, Palestine and like this, the genocide that Israel's committing in Palestine it is such a stark truth that cannot be denied. And and for a lot of people, they can't settle with it. And like you said, like the people who are organized just in general about helping their community, they see that and are involved. Can
I just make one other quick plug?
Please, I will let you talk as long as you want. I just want to be respectful of your time.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I'm easy right now. I don't have a hard stop at 11:30, but as the encampment movement has kind of dissipated over the summer, with some notable exceptions, and I want to shout those out because there's some summertime encampments that have like popped up and continued the struggle in a big way. But like that sort of hot point of confrontation between students and college administrators around divestment, as that has dried up, they are counting on us to forget about it and stop fighting over the summer. And a lot of that has been getting picked up by community organizations, including in like college towns like where I live, in cities for sure, to maintain that energy. And I would just say, though the encampments might not be there anymore where you live, there are local organizations that are trying to push for municipal ordinances around divestment. There's groups that might be trying to directly look at weapons manufacturers and how they might be confronted or disrupted, that you're going to want to check out offline. All of that. And I just think it's super important to like right now find an organization in your community that's carrying the work forward over the summer after the encampments have kind of died down, and see how you can show up. There's people's universities that are popping up as like weekly events in a lot of cities that you can show up to. All this stuff that's happening that I just think is super vital to keep that energy going and to show that this isn't just college kids that care about this. This is everybody, and that this is a mass, durable movement that's going to really carry forward through the summer. And so I just want to shout out all the people that are not affiliated with colleges and universities. We got a lot of press, for that stuff during the term, but the struggle continues most of all in Gaza, most of all in Palestine, and the actual resistance that's happening there is the center of it. And whatever we can keep doing to create space for that resistance to thrive, we really ought to be doing, and we can be doing. And given how central dismantling these systems are to keeping the planet habitable, doing that work is for all of us. It's really for everybody.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate, all not only just like the accurate analysis of, some of the trouble that we're in, but also, representing and lifting up a lot of the organizations that are, doing the right things. And also, I don't know that I've heard anyone kind of like put these different movements, as a collective like front that can really drive home. But who knows if that can keep growing and branching out, we could really, really see some hope. I do, since you, gave me and then I would like to ask more about the connection on campus about the military industrial complex and higher education. And this is something that I, realized as not only was I, was like going to university after I was in the military, but through my work as a staffer, I was like able to like different college campuses are also, like a lot of organizing for some of these elite meetings and stuff like that. And I start noticing, General Dynamics Center for Technology, Raytheon Center for, laser, whatever, and like all of these things. So is that, something that is in any type of discussion with organizing professors? Is this something, if you could just talk to that, I'm very curious.
Absolutely. And again, shout out to UMass dissenters at the University of Massachusetts as a group right around me that's been doing a lot of amazing work on this, that has researched these connections really deeply. But yeah, so when we were organizing faculty here, this did come up and it came up in kind of a pretty cynical way. And we heard these conversations before the faculty meeting that we held, and I'm legitimately not allowed to talk about anything that happened in the faculty meeting.
Yeah.
I could get trouble, so I won't do that. But even before that, we heard arguments along the lines of, well, if we try to divest, we could compromise funding for especially our STEM faculty, who often depend on U.S. government grants and funding of this kind, blah, 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 blah. And one of the things, again, that was really cool to see were especially kind of younger STEM faculty stepping up and saying, hey, you know what? I have a grant from whoever, and if I were to lose that funding because we divest, that would be a small price to pay to stop a fucking genocide. So do not even think about using me and my research as a shield for any of this stuff, right? And it was really cool to see people stepping up and saying that. Now, that said, there's a structural problem here, right? There's a structural problem where there is a huge connection between, the military-industrial complex and a lot of different lines of research in academia. I couldn't really speak to the details of how much and to who, but I do know that it's a big thing. Yeah, I also know again that there's organizing among faculty that have been implicated in that stuff in the past. If you're an astrophysicist, if you're a physicist, oftentimes that's where you go to get your money, and there's not really a lot of other options. But people are not cool with that. People are not okay with that, and people are resisting that.
Yeah, no, and that's something that I haven't really seen like any type of huge work that can kind of point to this as an overall thing. It is a major industry, and once you get into pharmaceuticals, the certain organizations are going to be influencing the academia and and all these other things. It's just where science and technology is more devoted to killing than life-saving is kind of one of the just structural, like you said, structural issues, that are probably stopping us from getting to where we need to go.
100%. Yeah, exactly. Which is why we really gotta, liquidate all the big private universities with their massive endowments, take that shit back public, and just fund education for all with public money. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It seems pretty simple, and it's so frustrating too. I'm it's going back to even your passive. Once you find the right answers that are just simple of well, no, we're all human and we could actually work together to solve our problems if we don't try and oppress each other. And you try and convince your colleagues, hey, what if we actually did this? Do you recognize we're not really doing anything? We're not helping actually. Do you recognize that? And there's kind of sometimes this oh no, now you're weird, and it's I notice your little poster, the star, the labor is entitled to all it creates, and it's right in our face. But also it's Gil Scott Heard, it starts in your mind and really being able to change minds. And this is where I do think it's less about now of professing some type of right thing on Twitter. I'm correct this, but more so about, can we develop these organizations? Can we be a part of these movements? And can we connect these things?
Yeah.
Because once they're connected and we all start kind of rowing that boat in the same effort, we can change the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I was just in the UK as part of this big old trip I just did. And I was in Brighton in the UK hanging out with a friend. And they have an L3 Harris factory in Brighton. L3 Harris is a major weapons manufacturer. I think it's a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, which is another major one. And we, right where I live in Western Mass, we have an L3 Harris right here. And it was just really cool to be able to talk to people from a different country in a different context. Like, hey, how did you get your L3 Harris factory shut down? Because they got it shut down. And being able to have that conversation, now I can talk to my comrades out here and kind of bring those insights to bear on our efforts here around this weapons manufacturer. And so just being able to stay connected across places, I just think I feel really fortunate to have been able to have those conversations, and I just think it can be really fruitful to be able to make those kinds of connections across the world. Like, to me, that's just kind of what solidarity looks like, and it's a powerful thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate everything you said, and hopefully we can have you back again to get into more of the details too about some of the climate solutions, how to drill down in some of these other policy and programs so that people can just start engaging in these behaviors, because some of this communal support stuff, I don't know that some of these, beginning things are our own organizational issues and not necessarily take over the state issues. And so thank you so much for all that you've said. I feel like we've covered a whole lot. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything for you to plug, if people want to take your class, you got to apply to Amherst College, I guess. But if there is anything that you would like to plug, and thank you so much again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I don't have anything that I need to plug about myself other than follow Palestine, Palestine Youth Action, follow Palestine Action, do what those organizations are calling for. Those are the folks to be following right now. Thank you so much. It was really fun talking to you, and I really appreciate what you do as well. I haven't listened to a ton of your stuff, but I just think that bringing this kind of lens that you bring is super important, because it shows a space of like moral possibility, just given the perspective that you come from, I think is not visible to a lot to people.
Hey, thank you. You do. Yeah, and honestly, we got to thank Steph, because she is now going to be the catalyst of this thing even going forward and being able to move in a greater direction. So the connections and the mutual friends, that's how we make this thing go on. But thank you so much. I hope we can talk again soon.
Absolutely. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Peace.